When the American artist Catherine Carl arrived at the Summer Palace, it was August the 7th, 1903. The date had been specially chosen by Empress Dowager Cixi because she believed it to be auspicious. Carl later wrote a book providing a detailed account of her experiences at the Summer Palace. She wrote, "At the entrance to the Summer Palace, I was transferred to a palace sedan chair enshrouded in red silk, and then I entered that mysterious world." I was carried past buildings of every description and one beautiful flower bed after another, and was delivered to a large rectangular courtyard filled with exotic flowers and beautiful shrubs. The courtyard belonged to Le Shou Hall, the Hall of Happiness and Longevity, the Empress Dowager's personal living quarters, and the beautiful flowers Catherine Carl saw were symbols of wealth and rank: magnolias, flowering crab apples, and peonies. At its southern end, the courtyard led to Lake Kunming. Its northern end extended to Longevity Hill. It was the largest courtyard in the residential section of the Summer Palace. Inside Le Shou Hall were 2 rows of buildings running north to south, and 2 adjacent buildings, one each to the east and west. In total, 49 buildings occupied the courtyard, all of them connected by corridors. The buildings on the east and west sides each had 10 rooms inside. These were the bedrooms for Cixi's female attendants. Along the north side, there was a row of 9 rooms where Cixi kept her personal treasures. East of Le Shou Hall is Longevity Chamber. This was the living quarters of the chief eunuch, Li Lianying. A small gate in the west courtyard wall created a shortcut between the chamber and Le Shou Hall so that this loyal servant could be at the Empress Dowager's call at all times. Le Shou Hall lay beside the pier of natural affinity of water and trees, facing south. In front of it were 6 bronze statues, 2 each of deer, cranes, and jars. In Chinese, 6 deer, cranes, and jars sounds like Luhe Taipian, meaning universal peace and tranquility. The main chamber in Cixi's personal quarters lay behind a glass door. Empress Dowager Cixi's throne was sited in the centre of the main chamber in Le Shou Hall. A carpet lay in front of the throne, and incense burners stood in the 4 corners surrounding it. Behind the throne there was a large glass screen consisting of 12 panels. On either side of the throne were large stands made of magnetic rock. When the Empress Dowager was there, these stands would be covered with fresh fruit. The fruit wasn't intended to be eaten. Instead, it filled the hall with a pleasant fragrance, and it was the reason why the chamber was known as Fragrance Hall. The Empress Dowager's bedroom lay on the west side of Le Shou Hall. On each of the 4 walls there was a large glass mirror with the character Longevity written on it in gold. Along one side there was a richly decorated heated brick bed covered in bright yellow fabric. Next to it there was a Western-style sofa chair upholstered with satin fabric and with a Chinese-style orchid embroidery. A number of clocks and an array of jewellery were arranged on tables below the mirrors. According to records from the time, Cixi kept no fewer than 85 clocks in Le Shou Hall. Even though many of them were in her bedroom, she was able to sleep soundly without awakening when they struck the hour.
The American artist Catherine Carl was mesmerized by the Summer Palace, its beautiful gardens, and the extravagant lifestyle of its inhabitants. But why was Empress Dowager Cixi so keen to host the foreign artists there? And why was the tottering Qing government so determined to make a spectacular impression at the 1904 World Fair? All is revealed in the 9th episode of Untold Stories from the Summer Palace.
The American artist Catherine Carl wrote, "Suddenly, a silence descended on the hall, and I quickly turned my head. I noticed a short, slight noblewoman approach me with a broad smile on her face. The smile on the Empress Dowager's face won me over completely. I unthinkingly took the dainty hand she extended to me and lifted it to my lips. This was seemingly just a formality, but it sprung from an admiration in my heart for her totally unexpected beauty. I was a nervous wreck, and just then 85 clocks announced it was 11 a.m., each in its own distinctive way. The auspicious time to begin the painting had arrived. Probably few Chinese people, let alone a foreigner from the far side of the world, had ever been in such close proximity to the Empress Dowager. Catherine Carl wrote, "I picked up a charcoal pencil and drew the first line of a sketch for my portrait of the Empress Dowager of China. Everyone in the hall stood motionless and mute and watched my every move, because everything to do with Cixi is a solemn ceremony. When I began, the ticking of the clock seemed as loud as the ringing of church bells. My ears were ringing, and the sound of the charcoal on the paper was like a saw cutting wood. Fortunately, I quickly became absorbed in my work, and everything except the subject of my painting and myself seemed to just disappear." The first sitting for the portrait lasted until noon. The Empress Dowager seemed to be in no hurry to end the session. Afterwards, she showed Catherine Carl around the Summer Palace, and then invited her to the Garden of Virtue and Harmony to watch a performance of Peking opera. The Garden of Virtue and Harmony is just a short distance from Le Show Hall. Garden and hall were linked by the long corridor, so that when the Empress Dowager went out, she didn't have to worry about the sunlight or rain. The main stage in the Grand Theatre in the Garden of Virtue and Harmony was divided into 3 levels. They were known as happiness, employment, and longevity. From the lowest to the highest level, they were for portraying the affairs of humans, spirits, and the gods, respectively. The area below the stage represented hell. A winch and pulley system in the centre of the stage lowered or raised the actors when it was required to depict their characters ascending to heaven or descending to earth. Catherine Carl wrote, "The Empress Dowager closely followed my every move as I observed the Grand Theatre building. She walked down the steps of the Imperial Box and came towards me. Then she went up the steps to the stage and beckoned to me to follow. We were on the first level, and she suggested I go to the 2 upper levels, which were not to be found in ordinary theatres. The steps up to them were behind the scenery. She climbed the steep stairs as easily as I did. Then she said to me, "I doubt if you'll be lucky enough to see such a fine Chinese stage tower again." Opposite the Grand Theatre stood the Hall of Pleasurable Smiles. This was where Cixi sat or reclined whenever she watched an opera performance. There was no throne in this hall for the simple reason that performances often lasted for several days, and Cixi preferred to watch them from a heated brick bed. She would watch an opera sitting or lying down, depending on her mood. Such was Cixi's great love of Peking opera that outstanding performers were not only paid well, but often rewarded with noble rank. All the troupes that performed here did so with the tacit understanding that they observe one cardinal rule: every empress in their plays or operas had to be depicted in a positive light. Thanks to Empress Dowager Cixi's support, Peking opera entered a golden age. Garden of Virtue and Harmony became the most prestigious venue in the whole of China, and all the leading actors of their day, including Yang Yuelo and Tan Xin-pei, performed there. Catherine Kao knew very little about Chinese drama, but even so she was fascinated by the design of the stage. She was also delighted by the music, colour and stage sets used in the performances. How the members of the imperial family lived inside their palaces was a closely guarded secret. Naturally, it created great curiosity outside among Chinese and Westerners alike. The organisers of the 1904 World Fair wanted articles from the imperial household to be put on display in the Chinese pavilion. However, the imperial family were reluctant to let outsiders see their personal belongings. Prince Bo Luan, the head of the Chinese delegation to the World Fair, eventually came up with a solution. He would have a replica made of his own living room and bedroom. The newspapers excitedly reported that a magnificent replica of a Chinese prince's home could be found between the British and Belgian exhibits. With its brilliantly coloured roof rising steeply from the four corners, it was the most beautiful building at the fair. The popular admiration for the prince's house was such that China gained newfound status in the world.
The American artist Catherine Kao was mesmerized by the Summer Palace, its beautiful gardens, and the extravagant lifestyle of its inhabitants. But why was Empress Dowager Cixi so keen to host the foreign artists there? And why was the tottering Qing government so determined to make a spectacular impression at the 1904 World Fair? All is revealed in the 9th episode of Untold Stories from the Summer Palace.
3/4 of the area of the Summer Palace is occupied by Lake Kunming. When the lotus flowers in the lake bloom in the summer, they present an enchanting sight. Catherine Carl on one occasion had the privilege of going for a boat ride on the lake in the Empress Dowager's personal boat. Carl later wrote, "The boat had been brought to the dock very early. Cixi, accompanied by her retinue, walked down the pier of natural affinity of water and trees and climbed onto the boat. Cixi sat on a gold throne. The empress, princesses and attendants sat along the sides, and eunuchs rowed the boat standing up. As we rowed away from the dock, I turned my head to look at the halls, the temples on the hill, and the strange jade belt bridge. Suddenly, the beautiful white marble platform in the middle of the lake appeared, as if it were an apparition. The Empress Dowager frequently interrupted Catherine Carl's work so that the artist could accompany her on walks around the palace grounds. But Cixi's attitude to Catherine Carl swung to and fro in much the same way as her foreign policy. Sometimes she played the role of generous host, but at other times she was on her guard and even instructed her lady-in-waiting Ling to keep an eye on the American. However, no matter what Cixi's mood was, Catherine Carl was always free to roam the summer palace and enjoy its scenery. In different gardens with their different landscapes, Catherine Carl found colours and compositions that were substantively different from what she was familiar with in the West, and yet functionally similar. She came to realise that the aesthetics of Chinese landscaping were closely related to the country's artistic style in terms of layout, mood and appeal. It was around this time that Cixi became fascinated with cameras. She quickly lost interest in sitting on her throne to have her portrait painted. However, because the focus on the early cameras was fixed and it was difficult to change the composition of the picture, the camera had to be set up first, and then the people moved into the appropriate position at the correct distance. From 1903 to 1906, Empress Dowager Cixi had 786 photographs of herself taken, most of them against the backdrop of the Summer Palace. Cixi enjoyed dressing up as the Bodhisattva Guanyin. In fact, she even liked people to call her the Buddha. She was fascinated by gadgets from the West. When she returned to Peking from Xi'an in 1902, she had the first imperial telephone line installed at the Summer Palace. An automobile given to her as a birthday gift by the warlord Yuan Shikai was probably the first ever automobile imported into China. However, Cixi felt that it was disrespectful to her for the driver to sit in front, so she required him to run alongside the car and drive it that way. When this proved to be impractical, the car became an ornamental fixture. As Cixi was preparing to celebrate her 70th birthday at the Summer Palace in 1904, war broke out between Japan and Russia. The two countries were fighting over Chinese territory in the northeast, and at Japan's request, the Chinese government declared its neutrality. In the year that Cixi had turned 50, the Sino-French War had broken out. The year she turned 60 saw the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War. And now that she was turning 70, Russia was at war with Japan. Cixi was furious that every time she celebrated a major birthday, foreigners spoiled it by starting a war. The end of the Russo-Japanese War saw all the Chinese territory that Russia had occupied passing into the hands of the Japanese. The Empress Dowager received a gift of a small steamship named Eternal Peace from the Japanese to thank China for its cooperation during the war. Japan's victory over Russia, so the Qing government concluded, was a victory for a constitutional country over an autocratic one. Following this line of thinking, in 1905, Cixi ordered 5 high-ranking officials to go on a fact-finding tour abroad to study constitutional monarchies. However, on September the 24th, a group of radicals, feeling that the mission was a superficial approach to solving the country's deep-rooted problems, blew up the train the officials were on. 3 of the officials survived, and on the 25th, they went to the Summer Palace to report on the incident to Cixi. When the Empress Dowager heard their account, she wept. Her response was to order the wall around the Summer Palace to be raised by 3 feet. Still today, the line marking where the new edition begins can be seen on the wall. Catherine Cowell spent more than 9 months at the Summer Palace, and in that time she painted 4 portraits of Cixi. Empress Dowager Cixi in court robes was the first to be finished. The brushwork is exquisite and the colours are rich, but it is subtly different from most Western oil paintings. Western painting techniques dictate that the subject's face should be illuminated by a light source in order to create a contrast between light and dark. Cixi, however, preferred the Chinese style of painting faces, and in the end, that's how Carl painted her. The portrait of Cixi that was exhibited at the World Fair in St. Louis caused a sensation. When the portrait was later presented to the United States government by the Qing court, President Roosevelt held a ceremony at the White House to accept the gift. Today, the painting is still part of the collection of the Smithsonian Museum.
Not long after the death of Empress Dowager Cixi, the imperial family vacated her spectacular garden, the Summer Palace. And yet, they still had to pay for its maintenance. How did they do it? And what would the arrival of the People's Liberation Army in early 1949 mean for the Summer Palace and for the city of Beijing? To find the answers, watch episode 10 of Untold Stories from the Summer Palace.